Hi, my name is Rachel, and I need to get something off my chest. Something I've kept buried for too long before you judge me. Please listen to my story. I never thought I'd find myself in a situation like this, and I still struggle to understand how everything spiraled so quickly. It's a memory that has haunted me for years. Something my husband, Madame, do that changed the course of my life. It all started a few years back. John, my husband, and I had been married for almost 10 years. Like most couples, we'd had our ups and downs, but I never expected this. John was a loving man, but over time, something changed. He became distant, more controlling, and less affectionate. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was just the stress from work. But deep down, I knew something was wrong one evening. John came home from work with the strange energy about him. He seemed unusually upbeat, but there was something almost unsettling in the way. He looked at me, we had dinner as usual, and just as I was about to clear the dishes, he asked me to sit down. His tone was serious, so I complied, my heart starting to race, sensing that this conversation wasn't going to be an ordinary one. I've been thinking, he started, his eyes avoiding mine. There's something I need to share with you. I nodded, waiting for him to continue. But the words that followed were not what I expected. He told me that he wanted to spice up our relationship, that he'd been feeling bored, and that he thought it was time we'd tried something different at first. Thought he meant a romantic getaway, or maybe some counseling to rekindle the spark, but no. What he suggested was far from that. I've arranged for us to meet two men, he said bluntly. They're coming over this weekend. I stared at him, not understanding what he was getting at. I didn't know if he was joking or if this was some sick test, but his expression was deadly serious. My stomach twisted and I felt a wave of nausea wash over me. What do you mean, two men? I asked, my voice barely a whisper. They're friends of mine, he said, trying to sound casual as if this was normal. We're going to spend the night together with them. I was speechless, my hands trembled as I tried to process what he was saying. This wasn't my husband. This wasn't the man I had vowed to spend my life with. He was talking about bringing two strangers into our home, into our marriage, like it was nothing. The thought alone made me feel sick, but more than that, I felt betrayed. How could he even suggest something like this? John, are you out of your mind? I finally managed to say, my voice shaking with a mixture of disbelief and danger. This isn't us. Why would you even? But before I could finish, he cut me off. Rachel, this is happening, he said, his tone sharp. You need to understand, it's something I want, something we need. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. I loved JN, but I couldn't understand why he was pushing me into something so degrading, something that felt like it would shatter everything we'd built together. I told him no, that I wouldn't go through with it. I thought that would be the end of it, that he'd come to his senses and drop the idea. But I was wrong. Over the next few days, John grew more distant. He hardly spoke to me unless it was about the plan. He started coming home late, and when I asked where he had been, he gave vague answers. Our conversations became tense, and the love that once filled our home was replaced with a suffocating silence. I felt trapped, isolated, and confused. How had our marriage come to this? By Friday, the dread had settled deep into my chest. John was insistent that the meeting was happening no matter what I said. I considered leaving, packing my bags, and walking out the door. But I didn't, as much as I hated to admit it. Part of me was still holding on to them, and I thought, I knew, hoping this was just a phase, something we could work through. I wasn't ready to throw away our life together, but at the same time, I couldn't bear the thought of going through with this plan. Saturday evening arrived too quickly. The men John's so-called friends arrived promptly at 8 p.m. I sat on the couch, my hands clenched in my lap, trying to hold back tears. I didn't even know their names, and now they were sitting in my living room talking to my husband as if they were old buddies. The air was thick with tension, and I could feel their eyes on me, watching, waiting. I wanted to disappear, to run out of the house and never look back. But then John leaned over to me, his hand resting on my knee. "Rachel, it's time," he whispered. I froze my mind, screaming at me to get up and leave, but my body refused to move. John's hand felt like a weight on my knee, anchoring me in place. I couldn't look at him, and I certainly couldn't look at the two men sitting across from me. My heart pounded in my chest, and the room seemed to close in around me. "Rachel, please," John said again, his voice lower now, almost pleading. There was something in his tone that made me pause. It wasn't just insistence, it was desperation. For the first time in days, I saw a flicker of vulnerability in his eyes. This wasn't just about satisfying some twisted fantasy for him. It was about control, power, and something deeper that I couldn't quite understand. But that didn't make it right. None of this felt right. "I can't do this, John. I finally," whispered, my voice cracking. "This isn't who we're." He sighed heavily and sat back, rubbing his temples in frustration. "You think I want this?" He muttered, more to himself than to me. "I'm doing this for us, Rachel, don't you get that? No, you're not." I shot back, finding a sliver of strength. "You're doing this for you. You've changed. John, this isn't about us anymore. It's about control." For a moment, I thought I saw a guilt flash across his face, but it was gone as quickly as it came. Instead, he clenched his jaw and stood up, pacing the room like a man who had lost his way. I wanted to reach out to him to pull him back to the man I once knew, but I didn't know how. We were so far from where we'd started, and I wasn't sure if we could never find our way back. As thessalants stretched between us, one of them, and let's call him Marcus, cleared his throat. He seemed to sense the tension, but there was an air of impatience about him. "Look," he said, his voice calm but firm. "If this isn't happening, we should probably leave." I glanced up at him, and for the first time I really looked at him. He wasn't what I expected. He was calm, respectfully Lewin, and his demeanor seemed more sympathetic than I had imagined. I had built up this idea in my head that these men were predators, but they weren't. They were just people. And somehow that made the whole situation even more confusing. I didn't want to stay. I didn't want to be part of whatever this was becoming, but the weight of everything, the years with John, the love we once shared, the hope that maybe somehow things could go back to normal, kept me sitting there. I didn't know what to do. I felt trapped, suffocated by my own indecision. Then John spoke, his voice quiet but resolute. "Rachel, if you leave, we're done." The words hit me like a punch to the gut. I looked at him in disbelief, trying to comprehend what he had just said. He had drawn a line in the sand, and I had to choose which side I was going to stand on. I felt tears welling up in my eyes, but I blinked them back, refusing to let him see me. "Break, I've given you everything," he continued, his voice steady but cold. "I've provided for you, loved you, and this one thing is all I'm asking for in return." I stood up, my legs shaky but determined. "This isn't love, John," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "This is manipulation." His eyes flashed with anger, but I didn't care anymore. I couldn't do this. I wouldn't do this. I turned toward the door, fully expecting him to yell, to grab me, to try and stop me. But he didn't. Instead, I heard him mutter under his breath something like, "You'll regret this." Maybe leaving was a mistake, but in that moment I knew I had to walk away. I couldn't let JN or anyone force me into something I wasn't comfortable with. As I stepped outside, the cool evening air hit my face, and I felt a strange mixture of relief and heartbreak. My legs carried me down the street, my mind racing. Where would I go? What would I do? I had no answers, only a deep sense of betrayal and loss. I wandered for what felt like hours before I found myself standing in front of my best friend Sarah's house. I knocked on the door, praying she was home. When she opened the door, saw my tear-streaked face. She didn't ask any questions. She just pulled me into a tight hug, handled me inside over the next few days. I stayed with Sarah trying to process. Everything that had happened, I felt. Empty, like a part of me had been torn away. I missed John, but I also knew I couldn't go back. The damage had been done, and there was no repairing what was broken. JN tried calling me a few times, leaving voicemails that ranged from apologetic to angry. He was all over the place, and I couldn't keep up with his shifting emotions. I didn't answer any of his calls, and eventually he stopped. Trying months passed, and I began to rebuild my life slowly. But surely I filed for divorce, knowing that our marriage was beyond saving it was the hardest decision I had ever made. But in the end, it was the right one. I couldn't stay in a relationship where I was being manipulated and forced into situations that went against everything I believed, and I still think about John sometimes, about the life we could have had if things had been different. But I've come to realize that I deserve better. I deserve a love that is built on trust, respect, and mutual understanding, not control and manipulation.